At Glenn Toyota, there's a simpler, faster way to shop for a new car. Our zero-pressure environment and easy-to-understand pricing make car buying quicker and easier than ever. Route 208 in Fairlawn across from Nabisco, or visit glenntoyota.com today.
Will take the trouble and have the intelligence or patience to follow and examine every one of my crimes and actions.
I encourage him to write his autobiography.
You will find that I have consistently followed one idea through all my life.
It took a couple of weeks until he finally started writing.
I preyed upon the weak, the harmless, and the unsuspecting. I began to hate those who abused me. Then I began to think that I would have my revenge just as soon and as often as I could injure someone else. During my 20 years in all the various prisons and jails I've been in, I've undergone every kind of abuse and punishment that the ingenious minds of many men could devise. The snorting bull, the hummingbird, the hose, water-cured, beaten, thrown into sweat boxes and half-cooked, thrown into ice-cold dungeons and half-frozen. For all the misery and tortures that I have went through, I have made other men go through many times over. Only worse. My motto is, rob them all, rape them all, and kill them all. This lesson I was taught by others. Might makes right.
Happy Memorial Day, everyone, and welcome to Travis and Vic's Drunken Horror Adventures special episode tonight. You know, we do it once a month. We talk about, real-life horror, and in this case, we're talking about Carl Panzram, and I believe we already have some guests waiting, so if Vic wants to go ahead and dip into the phone line, let's go for it.
All righty, man. Right now we have, I believe his name is Joe Goodman on the line.
Joel,
hello.
How's it going, buddy?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's fantastic to have you. I just have to say, as far as I'm concerned, you were an important piece of the documentary that John Borowski did on Mr. Panzram here. Can you kind of talk about, first of all, your background and then, which you actually contributed to the film?
Sure. I think giving you a little history about why I got in the prison business may be helpful. When I was born in 1954 in St. Louis, and my parents only took me on one vacation, and it was a train trip from St. Louis to Excelsior Springs, Missouri, which is just north of Kansas City. So I was 10 years old, and on this train was an Army soldier in dress uniform, and he had on handcuffs and leg irons, and he was being escorted by some officials. And that really stuck in my mind, and I didn't know what the questions to ask about this image that I saw. I now know he was on his way to the U.S. Army Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And when I was in 8th grade, I read Birdman of Alcatraz, and it really held my interest. And also during that period of time when I was young, I used to read the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And most of the stories back in the 60s were about crime in St. Louis. And I was very curious what happened to these people once they went to prison. So when I graduated high school in 1972, I had aspirations to become a certified public accountant, only because my cousin's wife's sister got the top score on the Missouri CPA exam. And I was a cocky 18-year-old, and I thought if she could do it, so could I. And a few weeks into my first college math course, I knew that wasn't a good choice. So I eventually changed my major to administration of justice because I had this fascination for prisons. And I pursued that throughout college, and I got some experience at a very tender age. I did an internship for Missouri Department of Corrections in their central office, and I said I'd like to get some experience inside the state penitentiary, which was the oldest prison west of the Mississippi. And Time magazine 3 years earlier, in 1971, called it the 47 bloodiest acres on earth. So at age 20, I got my eyes open very wide, and that led to me applying for an internship with St. Louis County government the following year. And when I went in for this interview, the valedictorian from my high school from the year previous was also waiting to be interviewed. So I didn't think I had a chance of getting this sought-after position. And when I got into the interview, I started telling them what I observed inside Missouri State Penitentiary the year before, and I got the job and the valedictorian didn't. So while in that job, I was advised by the training coordinator for the department, if you're going to work in this business, go to work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And that's what I did. I went to work with them in North Carolina, Butner, North Carolina, in 1976. Stayed with the agency for 31 years and retired on April Fool's Day 2008.
Very good. I'm glad you talked about the genesis of that, because I always think it's really important, to kind of find out where somebody's come from. Because, it's an interesting thing. How do you get into the career you're in? Because most of us just fall into it, but it sounds kind of like, it's something that had intrigued you almost since day one there.
And it still does intrigue me. I was always curious about how these places operated, and now I have a much better idea, but that curiosity is still there, and I keep my hand in the business for that reason.
Before we get into other things, I do want to ask you this, just because personal curiosity here. Did you find in the various prisons you worked with, were things generally pretty similar, or there was no set system to how things worked? It could be different from place to place to place.
There's some differences between how a federal institution operates versus a state institution versus a county jail. So when I got my initial exposure to Missouri State Penitentiary, I saw potential riots taking place because, or a potential riot because of a stabbing that took place early on a Saturday morning. And I was told by the recreation supervisor who had been there for many years, he said, if you see any inmates with white powder, run as fast as you can, because what they do is they have this lie that they throw in people's faces to blind them, and then they stab you and you can't identify them. So that was what I thought was normal. And when I went to work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons a couple years later, I thought I would experience the same kind of thing, and I waited and waited for years and years for something similar, and nothing happened.
Huh. So, yeah, absolutely. I guess that would, that speaks to almost every walk of life, how, some things are more structural than others and some things work better than others. Obviously, you found a better system elsewhere. And there's still a disparity with how jails and prison operates in different parts of the country. For example, a California state prison is going to be much different in atmosphere,
than a state prison down in Alabama or Mississippi.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to get into this actual film and your involvement in it, like on the website, it actually says that you served on as an advisor on several of the Panzram projects, including the 2002 book, Panzram, A Journal of Murder. So I'm curious, what actually got you into the subject of Carl Panzram?
It was 1974 when I was going to school at University of Missouri in Columbia. And I went into this little store in downtown Columbia, and it was a cigar store. And what I was doing in that store, 40 plus years ago, I can't tell you because I don't smoke. But I was in the cigar store, and they had a metal book rack with paperback books. And on that book rack was the book by Tom Gaddis and James Long, Killer, A Journal of Murder. And I bought that book, and with my fascination for prisons, it held my interest, and I used it extensively as an undergraduate at University of Missouri. And then when I decided to go back to school in 1978 at San Diego State University to pursue a master's degree, I used that book then, and it was during that year we learned that Henry Lesser, the prison officer from Washington, D.C., was retired and living in Los Angeles. I learned that from one of the professors, Tom Gitchoff. And so I knew the significance of what he did. He carried the Panzram manuscript around for 40 years, and so we invited him to come to San Diego State, and he came down in 1979.
So obviously you got to meet with him and kind of pick his brain as well?
Oh, yeah. It was an unforgettable experience because I was working at the time, or I went back to work in 1979, or actually 1978 for the Bureau of Prisons. I took off about 9 months to go to graduate school full time. And so when I met Henry Lesser, I was working as a prison officer for the Bureau of Prisons in downtown San Diego at their Metropolitan Correctional Center. And so I could really relate to him on a number of levels because of our occupation. And he, even though he didn't have any formal degrees that I'm aware of, he knew criminology as well as I did, and I was immersed in it in graduate school, and that was all secondary to Henry's character. He was a man of integrity and very intelligent, very inquisitive, and he was decades ahead of his time as far as doing the right thing when he was working as a young jail officer, and he treated people as human beings.
Well, as far as Henry goes, did you have the same opinions of him, going in as you did after the fact, or was it one of those things where you kind of came in a little bit skeptical because of the subject matter, or what were your thoughts going in as opposed to after you met him?
Well, I knew enough about him from what I had read, and meeting him there weren't any surprises. He was exactly as I thought he would be, and somebody I could relate to, and somebody I had respect for.
Well, I thought he was, obviously a major part of this story getting out. So, as far as it goes, if Henry had never been involved with Carl Panzram, do you think a lot of these stories would have ever been told in any way, shape, or form, or would it have just been lost in history?
It would have been lost in history. There's although Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, wrote a manuscript which hasn't been widely distributed that I'm aware of. He did mention Panzram, but not to the extent where what Panzram wrote was ever revealed. And so